You are listening to Movies to Watch Before You Die, episode number 9. Hello, everybody, and welcome to Movies to Watch Before You Die, a weekly podcast that breaks down the most important movies ever made that will change the way you think, change the way you feel, and hopefully change the way you live your life. I am your host, Mark Gazica, and with me today is one of my great friends, Alden Roth. Say hi, Alden.
Hi, Mark. How you doing?
I'm doing great. How are you?
Good.
Awesome. Alden, what movie are we talking about today?
Oh, the movie that I have called my favorite movie for about 7 years now, Donnie Darko.
Donnie fucking Darko. That's right. 2001 film starring Jake Gyllenhaal and Jenna Malone and directed by Richard Kelly. It should go without saying at this point, if you have not seen the film, press that pause button, go watch it. It's a weird one. It's a thinker, but it's good, and Alden and I are about to ruin it here, so make sure you've seen it. As always, there are links in the show notes for places you can rent or buy the movie, or if you're tight for cash, there's always the handy-dandy local library. So Alden, last time you were on, we watched one of your favorite films, Into the Wild.
Yeah.
And this time we're doing sort of the same thing. Is there a hierarchy to these films, Into the Wild versus Donnie Darko? Is one better than the other?
Well, to be honest, so for the longest time, V for Vendetta was my favorite film.
Okay. Another film we
And
did an
then
episode on.
then I saw Donnie Darko for the first time
Mm-hmm.
in, 11th grade. And I was like, that's my new favorite film. And I love Donnie Darko. It was awesome. Like, I just got into the whole mythology and deep storytelling, and like I was like searching the internet. I found like how they had that old website that like gave Donnie's past and all that. I bought the script book that comes with like pages from Philosophy of Time Travel or whatever the Roberto Sparrow's book is called, and I was just like deep into it being my favorite film. Then I saw Into the Wild, and I was like, this film is awesome. Like, I love it. It's one of my favorite films. And it was always my second favorite film. Just because I was so deep into Donnie Darko.
Yeah.
But after watching Into the Wild with you last time, and now watching Donnie Darko this time, I like both of the films a lot. I love them. But Into the Wild really hit me. I sobbed through the entire end of it.
Mm-hmm.
And like that hadn't happened before. I usually cried when Chris's dad was like, when he's out on the street.
Yeah.
I usually cried during that, but Donnie Darko, I've always been like, it's a great combination of theory and humor and drama and human emotion. And I still think that is true, but I don't know. I think Into the Wild might be surpassing it now.
Yeah, I think I had a similar experience as you. V for Vendetta was not one of my favorite films at any point, but I do thoroughly enjoy it. Donnie Darko was my favorite film for quite some time for all those reasons, and I can't remember what the time period was between seeing Donnie Darko for the first time and then seeing Into the Wild, but they were always at least both like in my top 5 at all times.
Mm-hmm.
And then the last time I saw Donnie Darko before this past viewing for this episode of the podcast was probably like 3 or 4 years ago. So this is like the longest stretch I've gone. I used to watch it like once a year or more.
Right.
And so watching it again this time, it's still good. Still holds up.
Yeah.
It's still a good film. But I guess in not seeing it for a while or in just changing over the course of a couple of years, a lot of the things that used to hit me really hard, didn't hit me as hard this time.
Yeah.
Or I focused on aspects of the film because there's so much that I didn't focus on before.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm curious to see where both of our opinions lie regarding those things.
Yeah. I mean, just in broad strokes, like everything I loved about it is still there. It's not like it loses its oomph over time, you know, like everything, all the lines are still hilarious and it just makes you think every time. But I think the way that I've grown as a person, Into the Wild now connects with me more, and that's probably why it
Right. And that makes
surpassed.
sense.
Like, not to take anything away from Donnie Darko.
Right. And I think it's the people. It's like Donnie Darko was a film before I even saw it. I was like 6, 7 when it came out, you know. So it's been doing its thing for a good time without me. Okay, well then, what's your general takeaway of the film? In as broad strokes as you possibly can.
I do think it's a fantastic combination of humor and drama and theory, like making you think about a lot of different things, religion, time travel, science, all that, free will. And it does go into some it goes deep into some human emotions. And I think that like just that whole Pandora's box of characters really sets an awesome story.
Yes, I think as a film, it takes on the scope of other films that have been made that attempt to link people together through seemingly unconnected events that you don't wholly realize how really connected they are until the end of the film.
Right.
Films like Magnolia or Crash are some examples, but this does so through the driving force of one singular protagonist.
Right.
And even after you watch it, you still don't completely see all the intricacies at work unless you thoroughly analyze it. And,
right.
and still, even then, you might not come up with anything.
Yeah.
So because of that, why don't we first begin by, I guess, giving our own theories regarding what we think happened or what we think important parts of the film actually meant.
Okay.
Because in watching the theatrical cut of the film, I won't say that much of it's left up to interpretation, but there is evidence for a few different theories that I think any viewer could take liberally. So I don't want to ask, what does Donnie Darko mean to you? But which of the themes, which pieces of evidence weigh the most heavily to you that make you believe one scenario was more prevalent or one set of explanations is more relevant than another? If someone watched the film and said, "Oh, I don't get it. This film was stupid. What happened? What happened again?"
All right.
Well, how would you answer that question?
Let me break it down for you. Whenever somebody's like, "What is Donnie Darko?" I tell them a giant bunny rabbit helps a teenage boy travel through time to save the world. Because that's how it was first told to me. My friend was like, "You gotta watch this movie." And I was like, "That sounds really dumb." And he pegged on to that. He saves the world by dying, and then you see how everybody is impacted by it.
Mm-hmm.
And like when he pitched it to me, it made it sound like he died in the first 20 minutes, and then you saw it all. When really you see how he affected everybody in the last 5 minutes.
Right.
So basically, there's the main universe, and a tangent universe splits off of it, and Donnie Darko becomes the living receiver, and it's his job to have all of these events fall into place, ultimately letting a jet engine get sucked into a wormhole that then crashes on his roof and kills him.
In the primary universe.
Right. In the primary universe, it kills him. But that's like so surface level and really quick and
right.
Doesn't go into all the intricacies of it all.
No, because we could sit here for 7 hours and still be discussing the same thing.
Right.
I think that's the most popular theory, I suppose, because it's the one purported by the director, which is gone into much depth, or much more depth, I should say, in the director's cut of the film. There's also a huge camp of people that believe the film to be a time loop. They don't necessarily buy into the entire parallel universe, tangent universe theory. And this is the theory that I first believed.
Okay.
The first couple times I saw the film. I wasn't buying the whole tangent universe thing. I saw it more as every 28 days, the universe was recycling upon itself. And while, yes, the universe was quote-unquote ending, it was simply restarting with Frank summoning Donnie out of his bedroom.
Okay.
And until Donnie was able to make the choice to die for all of these people, the universe was going to just keep recycling.
Right. You could say that loop happens one and the same. Because I think that Donnie, at the end, has to understand that he has to die in order for the rest of the world to continue on.
Well, that's another thing that I've also taken problem with, in that when accepting the tangent universe theory, I have trouble coping with the fact that Donnie has to die in order to save everyone else, because that makes some acknowledgement to the fact that the tangent universe Donnie has the same understanding of what happened as the primary universe Donnie, who is the one who actually dies. And while everyone in the tangent universe is going to die anyway because the universe is going to collapse,
right?
Donnie dying in the primary universe is what ultimately saves
the primary universe.
The primary universe itself.
Yeah.
But had Donnie in the primary universe the knowledge that a jet engine was going to fall through his bedroom, he could have left the bedroom and the jet engine would have fallen, because the jet engine coming back to the primary universe was the simple act that restored the space-time continuum, not Donnie's death.
Right.
He simply died as like a byproduct.
Yeah.
Which, in realizing, if that's to be accepted, kind of weakens the effect of that almost a little.
I don't know. It's been a while since I've read the philosophy of time travel stuff.
Mm-hmm.
But I remember that the living receiver then had to die in the primary universe, because it was something like, if the tangent universe is always gonna die.
Correct.
That
It
is
has
always
to.
gonna end. But if the primary universe doesn't, if the goals in the tangent universe aren't met, then the primary universe will fail.
I think the goal is to return the artifact from the
Right.
tangent universe to the primary universe. The artifact in this case is the jet engine.
Yes.
And once that's returned, balance is restored. To the notion that the living receiver has to die, I think, is also false, because it can be assumed, or at least there's evidence for Roberta Sparrow having been a living receiver herself at one point. I think probably what would have prompted the writing of the philosophy of time travel.
Yeah. It's interesting. I never thought of that.
I just formulated these opinions upon my last viewing,
Okay.
because you watch it every time and you take away something new, or you focus on something differently, and
Right.
that specific set of events, Donnie's death having a specific meaning, that I really honed in on that this last time. And I don't know. I mean, we'll continue to dissect it as we move through the rest of this, because everything's connected.
Yeah.
But I don't know. Well, let's hop into the theory of time travel itself and see where that gets us.
Okay.
We'll start with an easy one. There's the scene where Donnie and Gretchen are presenting their science project.
Yeah.
And they come up with the glasses with
IMG.
pictures. Yeah.
Infant memory generators.
Yeah, I cringe at that title every time. But at one point, Gretchen poses a interesting question, and she asks, what if you could go back in time and take all those hours of pain and darkness and replace them with something better?
Mm-hmm.
What do you think? What if that were a possibility? What if that was something we could do?
Oh man, I think that gets into a lot of personal ideals, because if you have a good life, regardless of what led up to your good life, then you probably don't want anything to change. But if you're in a shitty situation, then you're probably like, yeah, I mean, I'm here because that terrible thing happened to me, and like if I could get rid of that, everything would be good.
Yeah.
I think that goes into just the idea of having regrets. There's a difference between having regrets and wanting to actively change what you did, or having regrets and understanding the person that they've made you.
Yeah. I think it's interesting, though, that she focuses on a very specific aspect of that in only mentioning pain and darkness. Because while those are both subjective things, they represent very individual emotions.
Mm-hmm.
Pain and darkness are things individually perceived by everyone that I think can be felt by seemingly normal, happy people.
Yeah.
People are on a day-to-day basis happy, and they're content with their lives, and everything is good. But pain and darkness can still be a huge part of those lives, I think.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess the question would be, how necessary are things like pain and darkness? Because the professor then responds with the point that maybe babies need that. Maybe
Right.
the absence of that is a problem. And then we can extrapolate that to, people in general. What is happiness without sadness? What is elation without pain?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, you have to know one to know the other.
Right.
If you've only ever felt happiness, then you have nothing to compare it to.
And it's ultimately meaningless.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I guess then it would really only, this idea would really only benefit people who existed far on the spectrum, on the far left of living in a state of constant pain and darkness.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think ultimately the question is really only posed as an allusion to Donnie as this sort of superhero possessing the ability to retract upon all of the sort of pain and darkness that ultimately was inflicted upon the world because of his actions in the tangent universe.
Right. Yeah, I'd never thought of that as like a time travel theme or example in the grand scheme of things.
It's vague, but I mean, I know I constantly think about just the ability to go back to a specific time in my life and just changing one thing.
Mm-hmm.
You know, you change this one aspect of one conversation or one interaction, one look you gave somebody, and then coming back to your present self and observing how deeply that affected the course of your life.
Mm-hmm.
Which I guess that's ultimately the butterfly effect. But it's something that fascinates me as an idea all the time. So moving on then, what are your general thoughts on time travel? Because the film takes an interesting approach in that it addresses it more as a philosophy than a hard piece of science. And while we have scientific theory that presents, I wouldn't say a clear model, but a theoretically understandable model of how time travel would exist in the world, the fact that we can't ultimately leaves it to something that we can only think about, something that exists as a philosophy.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's interesting because I think that the whole idea of time travel in Donnie Darko revolves around the philosophy of time travel, Roberto Sperer's book.
Yeah.
But then also Stephen Hawking's book, which I can't remember.
A Brief History of Time.
Brief History of Time. Because after I saw the movie, I saw the book in it, and I was like, oh, I got to read it.
Yep.
And it like goes into exactly what Noah Wiley's character talks about, how you need a large craft of some kind that could travel faster than the speed of light. That kind of time travel is like literal time travel.
Yeah.
Not the mythical idea of going into the future and like this crazy stuff. Like being able to time hop is what I feel like the traditional idea of time travel is. Like you could go back into ancient Roman times or something and hang out. But that's not really what Stephen Hawking's book outlines. And so I think in a way Donnie Darko's version of time travel is almost the most well thought out and solid. It doesn't leave a lot of stuff up to interpretation as far as the mechanics of the time travel. Like it's very set in stone how you have the living receiver that goes off into the tangent universe and needs to bring back the artifact, and like it gives you rules, whereas like something like Interstellar is so lofty and extrapolated and like people rip it apart all the time. But I think Donnie Darko's time travel is very set in stone of like how the mechanics of it work, and it's almost not necessarily time travel. It's more of like the tangent universe theory. I mean, I guess he does travel time technically, but it's not the popular idea of I'm gonna like Mr. Peabody's time travel.
Right.
It's not like you can set your machine to go to 1984 again or something.
Right. It's much more realistic than that, which I appreciate because I've seen many a time travel films, and the films are inherently good. The fatal flaw is just in the way they present time travel as this sort of willy-nilly, let's just hop through time without any repercussions and create a bunch of paradoxes that hopefully the viewers won't care about.
Right.
But I do care, and it irritates me greatly. And I honestly actually prefer the sort of lofty intellectual time travel of Interstellar.
Oh, I mean, I love it.
To Donnie Darko.
Okay.
Donnie Darko sort of set the stage for me. And I think it was one of the first films that sort of intellectually drew me in and sort of taught me that I could continually expect more from films that I was watching. I didn't have to set the bar so low. And I think in doing so, as a person, I began to become more interested in the arts and the sciences and just anything I could really get my hands on to help understand this crazy world we live in. And in doing so, I think I've formulated my own opinions about what time travel would entail in any capacity if it were to exist. And it causes me to see the time travel model Donnie Darko uses to be more and more absurd as I look at it more and more often. And I understand that's a piece of fiction, but I don't know, something that seems to be based so heavily in reality. It's such a real film. It creates a sort of, dissonance for me as a viewer now, which is weird. Because I definitely subscribe, I think, to the sort of multiverse theory of theoretical time travel proposed by sort of different string theorists. Are you familiar with?
Just give me a brief reminder.
It's essentially the theory of time travel utilized by Interstellar, in that we exist in the third to fourth dimensions of space-time. And ultimately, to be able to make peace with the events in Donnie Darko, we would have to, gain control of some sort of fifth dimensional understanding conception of the universe, in that choices create different timelines.
Yeah.
And that we would need the ability to switch between universes, or they're not universes. It's not really a tangent universe. I would call it a tangent timeline. It's the same universe. It's just a different set of options, choices that lead to different results.
Right. I mean, I think that definitely goes with Donnie Darko, because if you go like step by step, if Donnie didn't do everything exactly the way he did it, he wouldn't have succeeded in bringing the artifact back.
That's true, but my problem would be, within the fifth dimension, every action or non-action results in the creation of a split in the timeline. So there is a timeline in which Donnie Darko leaves his room and is not killed by the jet engine, and there's a timeline in which he is killed. And that in and of itself creates two different timelines. So the fact that it's assumed that Donnie Darko leaving his room when the jet engine comes through, that happened because of a glitch in time, insinuates that the fifth dimension does not exist, that there is one specific timeline, that the fourth dimension is the greatest dimension we can conceive of, and it only flows in one direction, and that is forward. And the best Donnie can hope to do with his ability to manipulate time is to look within that dimension, and he can then ultimately see the future and I guess see the past. The film doesn't really explore the past as much. It's more focused on the future. But it ignores the fifth through ninth dimensions that would potentially be extrapolated from that, which I don't know if I necessarily agree with. It's a minor point.
Yeah.
I'm being very nitpicky, and I'm aware of that, but
I'm definitely not briefed on my time travel and dimension knowledge as I once was. Like when Interstellar came out, I was on top of all of it, because I was like, everybody was like, that doesn't make sense, and I was like, actually it does. It's based on this science here and a little bit of loose interpretation.
Yeah.
But I don't know. I like to suspend my disbelief a little bit for Donnie Darko.
Yeah.
Because it's not so rooted in science the way that like Interstellar is.
No, and a high school kid is let out of his bedroom by a 6-foot-tall talking bunny rabbit that he can only see. So you got to suspend your disbelief somewhere in order to enjoy the film.
Right.
So, okay. Well, then let's move on to another prevalent theme in the film, which is the exciting one of death and dying and doom and gloom. A very notable quote from the film is that every living creature on Earth dies alone. What are your thoughts on this idea?
Right away, I want to be like, that's not true. Like, I could die right now. I'm with you. But I think it's not supposed to be read in a literal sense, rather more of a metaphorical way of saying that, like, yeah, you can have all this human connection and all that, but like at the end, it's just you and a creator if you so believe in one. But like, when you're dying, it doesn't matter if you're in the immediate vicinity of another person. Like, it's you and death and finality, and there's nothing after that. And like, don't they talk about somebody? Was it Donnie's dog or somebody's dog that goes under the porch to die? Was it? And his therapist says why, and he says because he wanted to be alone.
Yeah, and I think that example sums it up very well in that dogs are social creatures. They rely very heavily on interacting with other people, with other dogs, and those sorts of things. And the mere fact that dying is something an individual has to do on their own. You can have 10, 20, 30, 50, a million people around you at your deathbed. And none of it will help you cope with the fact that upon death, it's you and the endless void.
Right.
And that's something that everyone has to work through as an individual by themselves.
Right.
And it's a remarkable and terrifying thing to have to come to cope with and understand as a human, I think.
We as Americans don't like to embrace death. It's the thing we don't talk about.
We're terrible at it.
Right. And I like the idea of like celebration at death. I know that some cultures do like parties once the person has passed to celebrate their life instead of wakes and funerals to mourn it. But death is something that's so final, and we don't know what comes after it, that it's something scary that we sooner or later have to deal with. And I think that like the whole idea of the dog going under the porch so it could be alone is, in a way, it's like the dog thinks that it's doing the owner a favor because the owner's not going to see them die. But the lasting implication is that the person or creature is gone, and that you have to then deal with the emotional impacts of them being gone and the literal impacts of them being gone.
Right.
And I think that's what, like, the end of the film touches on is, yeah, Donnie might be dead. How did he touch all of these people?
Mm-hmm.
In little ways, you see how each person, each major character was touched.
Right.
It's very interesting to just see how it doesn't have to be a close relationship with somebody, but you can have a deep impact on them.
Yeah. And I know it's weird that I graduated high school a couple of years ago, and once every year, not at the same time, but once a year, there's some news bulletin about some kid that I grew up with dead.
Mm-hmm.
And it's never been someone I was remarkably close with or that I was ever really friends with. Some of the people I didn't even like. But just the fact that someone who you interacted with, and not even in any great capacity, is now dead.
Mm-hmm.
And you think about the implications that they had on your life when they were in it.
Right.
Or the greater implications they could have had, or you could have had on theirs. I think it humbles you. It puts the sanctity of your life in perspective, or at least it should.
Mm-hmm.
And it's something we don't like to think about, but I think it's necessary thinking, and it's healthy thinking, and it's important thinking.
Mm-hmm. The whole idea of just avoiding death until it happens blows my mind.
I mean, it's going to come. It's going to come someday, probably sooner rather than later.
Right.
So
I've been impacted by even people I don't know finding out they died.
yeah.
Like, there was a mountaineer recently, Kyle Dempsey, who died.
Mm-hmm.
And it was like this was a kid that everybody loved, you know. Everybody thought he was invincible.
Right.
And then he's gone, and it's like, I didn't even know him, but I'm like, wow, well, I should probably be more careful next time I go up on a mountain or something.
Yeah, it makes you think.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's always, that could have been me.
Right.
That could be me. Yeah. In connection with that, the conversation continues, and Dr. Thurman and Donnie talk about his loneliness. And Dr. Thurman asks Donnie, do you feel alone right now? And he goes on to say a lot about how he'd like to believe he's not, but he doesn't debate it anymore. He just accepts that he is assumed to be alone. And then he laughs and says, it's absurd. And then Dr. Thurman, interestingly, swings the conversation around and asks, the search for God is absurd. And Donnie says, it is if everyone dies alone. And she asks if that scares him. And he says, I don't want to die alone.
It's like a hard truth that you have to accept.
Yeah.
I think that's like a thing of, like, live your life to the fullest. Surround yourself with as many people as you want to, as many close connections as you can or as you want. And, like, in a sense, you can, if you always feel loved, then maybe you don't feel like you're dying alone.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't know, in those final moments, like we've said, I think it's just you and nothing.
And I think Donnie comes to terms with that by the end of the film.
I think so too. I think that's why he's laughing right before the jet engine comes.
Yeah. But one thing that always strikes me as odd in this scene is that he has a reluctant acceptance of the fact that he is alone,
Mm-hmm.
that he can't rightfully connect with anybody, or he has an inability to do so. And Dr. Thurman immediately turns that around and broadens the scope to say the search for God is absurd. As if, I guess, she's suggesting that with God, Donnie is never alone. But I find it odd that she took the conversation there as, you know, his therapist trying to draw information out of him,
Mm-hmm.
opposed to reacting to information he was providing to her.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? I mean, I'm not a therapist, but what do you make of her interjection of that? Because there's another scene, I think it's a deleted scene, so I mean, I guess we could argue it's not important at all, but Donnie's leaving a different therapy session, and she explains to him the difference between atheism and agnosticism, and then she tells Donnie he's an agnostic, and then he walks out and leaves. I mean, it's ultimately irrelevant because it wasn't included in the final cut of the film, but even if it were, it would still feel misplaced. In the same way, I almost feel this comment on her part is misplaced, or at least misguided.
Yeah.
I don't know. What do you think?
It's interesting because there's an odd religious tone in the whole thing.
Yes.
The fact that Donnie's at Catholic school and all that. There's the scene where Dr. Thurman hypnotizes Donnie, and he sees Frank, and he starts freaking out, and she says something like, the world will open up, and it will be you and God, doesn't she?
I believe so.
Yeah. So, like, I don't know. It is, She in a way is an odd therapist, and I don't know if she has a connection to the church or to the school or anything, but she does push some religious overtones as if she's trying to save Donnie or push him towards religion because she thinks that will save him.
And I find it odd that Donnie doesn't attack her for that, because he has a certain mental fortitude. He has a certain understanding of the way the world works and ideas people have and what that says about the people themselves. And I think he's able to read his gym health teacher, Miss Farmer, whatever the hell she is. He reads her pretty well.
Yeah.
And he reads Bill Cunningham pretty well, and his principal. And, he reads all these people around him pretty well. And I think for him to not be able to read that action happening on part of his therapist or psychiatrist or whatever, I guess she's a psychiatrist because she distributes medicine. It's irrelevant. For him to accept that as someone who seems to not wholeheartedly reject faith, but at least be skeptical of the existence of a God, I find that odd.
That he doesn't reply or retort to her saying...
Right. In any of the circumstances.
Yeah. Under the hypnotized one, I can see why he wouldn't say anything back to her. But I think he does retort in a way when she says the existence, or the... what's her line again? The
search for God is absurd, and he says it is if everyone dies alone.
Right, and I think that is his retort in a way. Yeah, it is absurd because we all die alone. Like, I may not want to die alone, but we do, and it's inevitable, and your search for God is absurd.
Yeah, and it's interesting how well I think this theme of absurdism ties into the sort of philosophical concept of absurdism. If you're familiar with the writings of the French philosopher and writer Albert Camus, he put forth the notion that in this sort of post-existential world we live in, if you're a proponent of existentialism in philosophy, it's the idea that we assign meaning to life. There's no inherent meaning in it.
Right.
Because modern existentialists have accepted that God does not exist. That is a given. It's up to us as humans to assign meaning. And absurdists take it a step forward to say that it's not only absurd that we believe there to be inherent meaning in the world, but it's equally absurd that we continue to look for it anyway. Humans can accept that God may not exist, but to continue to look for meaning in, the most mundane, typical things that happen every day is equally absurd. And I see hints of that in Donnie's philosophy on life scattered throughout the film.
Yeah, it is absurd, but it's how we cope with the world.
Right, and that's ultimately what sort of Albert Camus puts forth, is that in order to get past this idea of absurdism, there are three escapes you can make. One is a literal suicide. You can kill yourself because it wouldn't mean anything.
Right.
You could commit a sort of philosophical suicide, which he said would be to believe in some sort of God or create some sort of faith-based system that allows you to cope with an absence of meaning by creating a false meaning. Or he says you can embrace meaninglessness and revel in it, using your existence as a testament against that. And it's hard to say which one Donnie ultimately does in the end, because he does kill himself.
Oh, yeah.
But I think he also comes to embrace meaninglessness. He kills himself because he embraces meaninglessness. And we never exactly get a clear stance on what he believes, whether he believes God to exist or not, or if he has any sort of deeper faith. But I found it very interesting the way in which Donnie commented on those particular things to be absurd.
I think it's kind of absurd that Donnie also listens to a godlike figure and follows every order he's given.
Right.
As Frank being the godlike figure. I mean, everything that Donnie does in order to ultimately get the artifact is because Frank told him to.
Yeah.
And I don't know. I mean, like, that itself is like, you could perceive that as an existence of a God in that tangent universe.
Sure. And the idea that really God is definable to the person perceiving whatever phenomena said to be God as God, which Donnie does. So, I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know.
Let's move on to something I feel a little more certain about regarding the film. This is probably the most prevalent and obvious theme of the film, and that is sort of fate and destiny versus free will and the choices people have. So before we dive into what the theme or what the film has to say about this theme, what are your personal thoughts on the destiny free will dichotomy?
I believe that everybody has free will.
Mm-hmm.
You have the ability to do anything you'd like. I'm a firm believer that there are very few circumstances where you don't have a choice. The choice might not always be one you like, but I think you always have a choice.
Okay.
That's where I stand on it.
Okay. I reject libertarian free will as even having the potential to exist. I don't see any way in which we can freely choose our actions. I don't think the world is wholly determined. I don't think that there exists a specific destiny or fate that belongs to people, because I also accept that parts of the world are indeterminate, and they're merely probabilistic outcomes of chance combined with determinate systems of cause and effect.
Mm-hmm.
So we pretty much just flat out disagree on that debate completely.
But I think that something we didn't attach to the God conversation is when Donnie and his science teacher have the conversation about the spears coming out of people's chests, that they talk about whether or not you have free will, and I'm going to butcher it, but Donnie's like, if you have the ability to see the path, you could diverge from that path.
The conversation starts with his professor, science teacher, saying, I think what you're talking about is an act of God. And Donnie says, if God controls time, then all time is pre-decided. And his science teacher says, I'm not following you, even though I understood exactly what he was saying. He's just being obtuse.
Mm-hmm.
Donnie says, every living thing follows a set path, and if you could see your path or channel, then you could change the future, like it's a form of time travel. And his teacher says, you're contradicting yourself there. If we were able to see our destinies manifest themselves visually, then we would be given a choice to betray our chosen destinies, and the mere fact that this choice exists would make all preformed destiny come to an end. And Donnie says, not if you travel within God's channel.
Right.
I think there are a slew of contradictions in here made by both characters.
Yes.
But finishing the point you were making.
It's just that at the end of it, then Donnie is like saying that the fact that he brings into the idea of following in God's channel, is that what it is?
Yes.
Yeah, like, I don't know. There are so many times when it's contradicting what he's thinking about religion. But I think that the whole spear idea is so interesting because it does present the option of free will. It's so contradictory because you would, in theory, the spear should go wherever it only has one way to go. You can't leave the spear's path because it's going to take you to the ultimate end of your steps and wherever you're going. And when you're seeing it, you're seeing what is going to happen. So if in your mind you're like, I can see it, I can not follow it, you can't, because the spear is like taking into consideration what you're thinking and guiding you through that thought and action. Yes? Do you follow me?
I follow you. I just disagree with the way you're explaining it.
Okay.
In this, my thoughts on free will versus destiny relate back to my problems with the film's dissection and possibilities of time travel, because I believe they ultimately converge and become one and the same universal ideas. It's not our thoughts that are precipitating the movement or the motion of our destiny manifests itself as a water worm creature coming out of our abdomens.
Mm-hmm.
It's that the water worm creature coming out of our abdomens are necessitating our thoughts. And it's the idea that we need to separate the idea of self from consciousness. I think that's a problem we have as humans, is that we assign a lot of value to the fact that we perceive consciously from our minds and from our brains. But if we take a step back and look at it, you and I are nothing more than a conglomeration of cells and neurons and synapses firing in our brains that ultimately leads to us causing physical things to happen in the physical world.
Mm-hmm.
And so if I were able to see my destiny manifest itself physically, I wouldn't have a choice to stray from it or to alter it in any way, because that's what destiny is.
Right.
That's like saying, I'm looking at an orange, but I'm not looking at an orange. That you can't not look at the orange. Like, that's just like basic logic and reasoning.
Mm-hmm.
So the tenet of determinism is that every effect is precipitated by a cause. From the time the Big Bang happened at the beginning of our universe, atoms and molecules and dark matter and energy started hurling itself through the universe in a specific way, because A leads to B to C to D to E to F to infinity.
Right.
If the Big Bang were to occur again right now, and we were to press the fast forward button on the universe up until this moment in time, you and I would still be having this conversation right now.
Right.
And it would be the same for every time we reset the universe, because it's determined. The problem comes in that if we look at the universe at the quantum physics level, if we look down at the quarks and the bosons and the strings that things are supposedly made of by string theory, we realize that particles can exist as particles or waves of energy simultaneously. And because we can't predict whether they're going to be one or the other at any given time, if we bring that idea up to the macroscopic level, you could argue that nothing is predictable.
Okay.
Nothing is determinate.
Yep.
It's left up to chance. It's a coin toss.
Right.
So those two ideas seem to be at odds, and the choices of humans exist somewhere in the middle of that very broad spectrum we've just drawn.
Yeah.
And I think the solution is in the way in which I was trying to explain time travel before. I didn't really explain it very well. I just talked about the multiverse for a couple of seconds. If we look at the fourth dimension as a timeline, it is a line of time that extends for infinity in both directions, from our point now in the present to the past and the future. The fifth dimension would then be created by alternate timelines being created from every choice you and I are presented with. So I could choose to just slap the fuck out of you right now, right? If I were to do that or not do that, regardless, a tangent timeline, it would be created from that initial choice.
Right.
And so to say that I have a sense of destiny, or that I have no options, I think is ultimately just saying I have a fixed path that I have to follow through the fifth dimension of time. And to argue that one has free will, you're simply saying, well, you can follow your fifth dimension of time looking at every single choice and option that would have created a different set of circumstances, a different timeline, and just pick and choose, like you're picking what toppings you want on your McDonald's burger. And these are the things that I think about at night and why I don't sleep well.
Okay. Interesting.
Did I explain that well at all?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, I guess my idea of always having a choice could fit in with the idea of not having free will. Because my idea is more so the perceived option of choice.
And that's the key word there, perceived.
Right.
We all feel like we're free. Like I don't think that's even debatable.
Right.
But it's, looking at the truth value of that and not having an answer.
It's like, did I have the option to come record this podcast or blow you off? Yeah, I did. But it's at like that minute level that I think you always have a choice. But to say that my choices are not predetermined, and
I would argue that you didn't have a choice because certain circumstances or events or ways in which your brain was created outside of your control prompted you to, quote unquote, choose to come here tonight to record this podcast. Yeah. And that you feel like you've made the decision to do so, but you're ultimately just acting upon all of those unseen or unnoticed causes that have brought us here today.
Yeah.
So, but I mean, it's an idea. It's, we're not talking about hard and fast physics or science here.
Right.
So it's a lot. But back to Donnie and his teacher's discussion of this, because there's still a lot of hypocrisy and problems with it, I think. The professor puts forth the idea that what Donnie's talking about is an act of God, and Donnie says if God controls time, all time is pre-decided. What are your thoughts on that leap to a conclusion there?
In the world of Donnie Darko, it makes sense, because if everything in the tangent universe doesn't happen, then the tangent universe fails, and then leading to the world failing, to the primary universe failing. So, and that's why there is this Frank the Bunny godlike character leading Donnie through the whole thing.
I think Donnie's talking about God, though, not a concept of God.
Right. But I'm saying I think that's why I think Frank is there to act as the god of this tangent universe, whether Donnie is associating that or not.
So ultimately, God controls time and time is pre-decided, at least within the universe of the movie. I mean, I think the logic is sound either way.
Yeah.
If God controls time,
Right.
free will does not exist.
Right.
Because in his omniscience and omnipotence, he's aware of everything that can happen and will happen, thus it will happen.
Mm-hmm.
And sure, whether he's manifest as Frank in the film or not, I think I could follow this leap regardless.
Right. Yeah. I mean, yes, because then you get to the theory of, well, if everything doesn't happen to a T as it is supposed to happen, as God has predetermined it, then the tangent universe would be null and just would have no reason to even exist.
Which is also silly, because if God controls all time, God would have been aware of the tangent universe being created. So to say that it should not have been created would be untrue, because God could have just not created it,
Right.
or allowed it to be created.
Right.
And that's where I think in comes the theological philosophies of people being tested or people being put through certain trials or tribulations to prove themselves in the living world for XYZ upon death, which the film doesn't exactly touch upon, but I've heard that argument enough times to be aware of it enough. And then Donnie's retort to his teacher not understanding is saying, every living thing follows along a set path, and if you could see your path or channel, then you could see into the future, like it's a form of time travel. Do you agree with that? I think he's referring to being able to look into these sorts of worms he's been seeing.
Right.
And he does end up looking into one of them at the party, which causes him to then remember to go to Roberta Sparrow's cellar door.
Right. Because he looks into Gretchen's.
Right. And I think he sees the future.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, in a way, in the logic of the film, yes, that is a form of time travel.
I think I'd follow it into the real world as well. Because what is, if you were truly a fourth dimensional being, you would simply possess the ability to not see time as a line, but to instead be able to observe it conceptually so we can understand it more like a circle or a dot. And I think in Donnie having the ability to look within a person's destiny manifest, he's able to supersede or transcend the idea of viewing time as a progressive line. And that's where the sort of contradiction comes, though, that the professor, his teacher, proposes to have, because he's saying if you could see that, if you could see the destiny manifest itself, then you'd be given a choice to potentially betray that destiny. And I don't know if I agree with that.
Well, I think that's the thing, is that if you do see it, that doesn't mean that you have the option to go the other way.
Right. I think seeing it is seeing it, and it's going to happen because it's destiny.
I don't know. It's a curious thought, because we don't know really how descriptive the visions that Donnie sees in Gretchen's worm are.
Yeah.
But
or what he sees.
Right. But you would think that he would see Gretchen dying in that.
Yeah.
And he seems to be in love with Gretchen to a point that would make me think he would not go to Grandma Death's house if he had the option.
And he also seems genuinely surprised by the things that happened there.
Right.
So, yeah, I question what he ultimately saw.
Yeah, but I don't know. Because he doesn't seem so surprised by Gretchen's death. He gets surprised by the guys that put a knife to his throat.
He does kill Frank, though.
Yeah, but I think he somehow had a feeling, because when they're in the movie theater, Frank takes off his mask and you see his eye. And Donnie says, "What happened to your eye?" And
but
they don't say anything, and Donnie sort of smirks.
Right, but I guess my point would be he never would have had the bullet hole eye had Donnie not shot him.
Right.
And I think even if we fall back into our time loop theory of this continually happening over and over again, Donnie would have been aware of how it all went down every time, because he would have always looked into Gretchen's water wormhole, and thus killing Frank is an act of retribution, of vindication on Donnie's part, which is unfair because we see the effects of destiny and determinism in the film and how little control Frank had in committing this action, in the same way that Donnie had no control doing all of what he did over the course of the film. So I don't know, it seems almost wrong to blame him for that action.
To blame Donnie for shooting Frank?
For Donnie to blame Frank.
For killing Gretchen.
Right, because Donnie possesses an awareness of all of these actions that these other people don't.
Right.
Donnie almost plays a god himself in that regard.
Yes. But then that gets so deep into the whole idea that everything has to happen to a T the way that it did happen. in order for the tangent universe to exist and thrive at all. Because Frank is the manipulated dead. He's the character that dies in the tangent universe. That's why he's able to talk to Donnie, and it's like perceived as visions by Donnie. He's crazy, schizophrenic, and just seeing somebody. But in the theory of the tangent universe, Frank is the manipulated dead, which means he is able to guide Donnie through these steps. But it's also guiding Donnie to ultimately killing Frank, so that Frank can be the manipulated dead and then guide Donnie to ABCD.
Right.
And it is a loop, 100%.
I guess I just don't understand the initial causes of what precipitated Donnie to kill Frank. If Donnie saw the future, I don't think there's an answer to be had. I don't think there's an answer in the film.
Yeah.
I don't know if it's a fault on the filmmaker's part or a fault on mine for overanalyzing something that doesn't need so deeply analyzed.
Mm-hmm.
But the last point Donnie makes in his conversation with his teacher is not if you travel within God's channel. I don't know what the fuck that means.
Right.
Because God's channel would be destiny if God exists.
Yeah.
So he's already decided free will is not an option. God or no God, destiny. It's still a universal construct.
Yeah.
There's not like a super destiny or like a specific subset of it. I don't know.
That's definitely a packed statement. I mean, if we try to dissect it real quick, it's like giving a false hope to the option of free will. Like, well, I do have the option to break away, but I'm doing it because it's God's will.
It's like, yeah, it's giving credence to a non-position almost. And I feel like it's almost just a way for Kelly, the filmmaker, to just insert further evidence or this motif of religion or God in the film. Because even after watching the film so many times, I'm still curious about the film's ultimate stance on God and what it has to say about God. And I don't know if I have a definitive answer.
Yeah.
Another interesting aspect of that is that Roberta Sparrow herself, it said she was a nun at one point, but she left the church to teach science and eventually write the philosophy of time travel.
Mm-hmm.
I think it only makes sense that she would do so because she was part of another corruption in time, and she was chosen as a living receiver to return said artifact back to the primary universe. Her own tangent universe collapsed. The only difference is that she didn't have to be taken from it in the primary universe, and she was then able to write about her experience in the philosophy of time travel. What I find to be the most odd is I find that to be the most compelling case of there being a God within this universe, and that he's literally choosing people to fix these corruptions in time, but she abandons her faith almost from being a nun and goes to teach science. So what do you think the actions of Roberta Sparrow have to say about the film? Are they a testament to the existence of God and to the importance of religion? Or do you think perhaps that they're a strike against that and it's instead an advocation for science over religion?
It's definitely another contradiction because it makes sense. A lot of scientists, once they get very deep into science, don't believe in any sort of religion anymore.
Right.
And I think that's probably what happened to Roberta Sparrow. But what you bring up does make sense, that it almost feels like somebody is handpicking these people to save the world. In that handpicking, it's like it's very easy to assign all that power to God. It's much less believable to assign it to chance, fate, destiny, what have you. And I think as we touched on with Frank being an allegory in a way for God, it almost feels like the actions in the tangent universe are heavily orchestrated by God. And I don't know, I think the fact that she left the church for scientific beliefs that are so heavily seemingly rooted in religion, perhaps that cyclical back and forth of, was it religion, is it science? Like, just that paradox of the two of them being true at the same time, and her spending hours and hours thinking about it, I could see that being why she has sort of gone crazy and is grandma death. And I think you could also attribute it to, like, if she was in fact a living receiver at one point, but lived after it, that could add to the craziness that she endures and portrays through the whole film.
Yeah, I think that ultimately makes the most sense for me in explaining her character, having to live with that contention her whole life. But it's one thing I admire about the film is that it doesn't, when it doesn't paint a specific answer, it at least presents evidence for both sides of an argument. And you can ultimately just use your own confirmation bias to say, well, it was definitely this, it was definitely that. But I think I would much rather appreciate the fact that the ultimate message is that there sort of are no answers and that most of life exists in this weird gray space between these dichotomies. And this is, I think, a prime example of that. So, but let's move on to the ending of the film. There's a lot that happens in the end of the film. It's a long ending.
Yeah.
The first is that after the collapse of the tangent universe, everyone that Donnie affected seems to wake up from a dream, as if the tangent universe were some type of dream they had from the primary universe. And every time I watch the film, it ultimately makes me question, what are dreams? Are dreams these sort of collapsed universes that couldn't exist or were unstable and that we experience and have fleeting memories of? And the film doesn't really dwell on it. It's more or less just an interesting concept or an interesting take on dreams. Because I know there are some theorists who simply argue that the entire film existed within Donnie's mind in a moment in time before he was crushed by a jet engine.
Yeah.
Or that the whole thing literally was a dream. I think I disagree with that, but I don't know. There's some merit to the theory, I guess.
Yeah.
I don't know. What do you think?
I mean, you could definitely pick and choose things that could point to it being a dream the whole time, but I don't know, I'm not the best guy to talk to about dreams because I don't remember most of mine.
Yeah.
But
and even if you did, I don't know what that would do for you, because you don't dream about like normal shit. You dream about like weird stuff, like pandas and tutus. Like, oh, that's real helpful. Thanks.
Yeah.
Thanks, brain.
Yeah. I'm not sure what to make of that because I do agree that it seems like Dr. Thurman wakes up from a dream, but when I see it, it seems like most of the other people were already awake.
I think we come to them at different points as they begin to regain consciousness, and the fact that they are all in their beds or in their bedrooms points to them at least believing the events in the tangent universe to be a dream if they don't completely remember them outright. Dr. Cunningham is crying because his dream revealed the problems with what he's doing with the kiddie porn stuff, and I think Frank's sitting there and he ultimately goes and touches his eye because he gets shot in his dream.
Right.
And, the sort of evidence of those things, that sequence in and of itself, I think, is evidence of the fact that the tangent universe was not a dream. It actually happened.
Right.
And that these people are perceiving it to have been a dream in the primary universe.
Yeah, I can get behind that.
But Donnie, when we finally come to Donnie, there's a huge contrast with what's happening with him. He's sitting on his bed laughing. Why? Why do you think he's doing that?
I mean, he's been on quite the journey to this point, and I think that whether he believed what was happening was all real or not, the tangent universe, I mean, whether he actually believed that while it was happening, I think that once he gets back to the primary universe that he realizes what has to happen, and I think he's laughing because he realizes that he saved everything, but there's also the irony of at what cost he saved everything. Doesn't he say something? Isn't there a voiceover?
The quote is, "I hope that when the world comes to an end, I can breathe a sigh of relief because there will be so much to look forward to."
Man, that seems like the most religious statement so far.
It does. It's odd that he seems to now be welcoming death in the face of the fact that he was so troubled by it throughout the course of the film.
Yeah.
Because he's definitely accepted that he's alone by the end of the film. I don't think we can argue that he hasn't accepted that.
Right.
So he's now okay with being alone. Perhaps the reason he's been able to do so is because he feels that in death he will not be alone. He will. There's a tacit suggestion that he will go to heaven and be with God, perhaps.
Right.
What I find most interesting is we see him laughing, and the sequence ends. And when the jet engine finally rips through his room, he's gone back to sleep. He's laying back down. He's not sitting up in his bed laughing. It's not wake up from dream. Here comes the engine.
Right.
he goes on as if everything's going to be okay and everything's going to be normal.
Mm-hmm.
Which then leads me to question, if anyone were to remember everything that happened in the Tangent universe, it would be Donnie.
Mm-hmm.
We would assume that Roberta remembered if she was a living receiver.
Right.
So if Donnie remembered, then he chose to die. Staying in his bed, he chose to die.
Right.
Which brings up a whole nother set of implications that...
Well, that's assuming that he chose to die, which leads to an assumption that he had free will of whether he wanted to die or not.
But I don't know if we can argue, just because he's no longer the living receiver in the primary universe, to argue that destiny still wouldn't play a role. If God exists and he expects to be accepted into his kingdom, into heaven, when he dies, God would have been aware of that as well.
Mm-hmm.
And so it wouldn't have mattered what Donnie thought or chose because he didn't. It just happened.
Yeah.
I like to believe, and this is the belief I had when I first watched the film before I analyzed it so deeply that it has almost ruined the film for me, that he laughs because I don't think he views the Tangent universe as a dream. He knows he's going to die, and in laughing earlier in the film, when Dr. Thurman suggests that the search for God is pointless, him saying the world is absurd, and he's gotten to the point in life where he finds the idea of him not being alone laughable.
Mm-hmm.
And his life ends in a moment where he comes back to the primary universe and he is alone. Because there's also the suggestion that if he were to leave his bed and go out about his day and not die in that engine, that the same events would then happen in the primary universe that did happen in the Tangent universe.
Right.
I don't know if I can agree with all the implications of that because of everything Frank precipitates.
Right.
But there is a definitive parallel between Donnie Darko and films such as It's a Wonderful Life, and that you can look at life with or without these characters,
Mm-hmm.
and whether we can say it's better or worse. And I think ultimately the message of the film is it's not a wonderful life. There's lots of pain and suffering and hardship and things we don't understand and can't understand.
Right. Well, and I think that Donnie, to a point, whether or not he thinks he has the option to get out of his bed and live, if you take into consideration everything that's happened, I mean, in the Tangent universe, his girlfriend dies, his mom and his sister inevitably die, Frank dies, obviously, and there just is a lot of bad stuff, to whereas if he just stays in bed and dies and gets accepted into heaven or whatever, then he's saving all those people's lives.
Right. So I guess he's viewing it as a sacrifice.
Right.
And then that brings us back to the idea that knowing what you know now, would you make the same decision? That age-old question.
Right.
Well, then that depends on if Donnie has the free will to do so.
Yeah.
But then if he doesn't have the free will, if it's destiny, then he didn't choose to die. And it's just this circle of infinite catch-22s. And I have always stopped and taken solace in the fact that I think in certain instances there is something profound in ignorance. And that no one in the film is consciously aware of what Donnie did to save the primary universe.
Mm-hmm.
But their inability to understand that, to understand what happened, doesn't change the importance of Donnie's actions, and that you don't have to understand something for it to be important and for it to have an impact, like the movie.
Right.
It can just be.
Yeah.
Donnie Darko. Because if I can't grant that, if I can't accept that, then I don't know what to take away from the film. Because as you've seen, I have lots of problems with it as it sits.
Yeah.
Which are not the film's fault. They're more my fault. But it's a crazy movie.
It is. There are things that we didn't even touch on that I think we could have continued talking about.
We could do an episode on this podcast every week on Donnie Darko.
Yeah. I don't know. I think there are so many things that do have merit in the film that I think whether or not...
And I think things are only viewed as problems in the film by viewers who can't come to terms with their inability to plead ignorance.
Yeah.
And I think that's the greatest virtue I take away from the film. But are there any final thoughts or things that you wanted to mention or discuss that we didn't have a chance to pack into the rest of this?
So then there was one thing that I was sure you were going to touch on, but it's the whole lifeline exercise scene where Miss Farmer has them mark the exercise as either love or hate? Or is it love or fear?
It's love and fear.
Yeah. What do you think of that? The idea that all human emotion can either stem from love or fear.
As an idea, I think it's flawed for the same reasons that Donnie does,
Mm-hmm.
because, as he says, things aren't that simple. We can't lump things into those two categories. However, I think if we look deeply into the motives behind the motives, or the emotions behind the emotions, we can view love and fear as the two most basic.
Mm-hmm.
Because I think love and fear can be the most important and profound emotions one can feel, but also the most harmful and detrimental.
Mm-hmm.
And it goes back to the idea we talked about earlier, where you need both to be able to experience either. My problem with the film is that I think, or with that scene, is that it exists in a vacuum. And many analyses that I've read regarding the film, I think, attempt to put this scene not at the crux of the analysis, but to make love and fear much greater parts of the film than I think they actually exist to be.
Okay.
And I see this scene, it's profound still, but I see it as more of a one-off comment by Kelly on those two emotions.
Right.
That you can argue parts of the movie and characters' actions are coerced by love or fear, but I don't see those emotions coupling with any of the other major themes of the film that drive any actions.
Right. That is not. I don't think that's in any way the major theme of the film.
Right. Because it's a good scene. It's an important scene.
Mm-hmm.
But when analyzing the plot especially, and the major themes of the film that surround Donnie's actions, I find it to be irrelevant.
It's definitely like a character building moment. It elaborates on how Donnie views the world and how he perceives other people's actions. But
Yeah.
I don't think you could try to say that everything Donnie does in the film is based on love or fear.
No, and I've seen many analyses where they'll do this sort of wants versus need, felt fear but needed love things, and you can make arguments for things, sure. And I mean,
Yeah.
most of the film was precipitated on that anyway, but I see them as stretches.
Yeah.
So, okay. Last question then. We've talked a lot about the plot of the film and the themes of the film, and we've analyzed, at least half-heartedly, what some of those things mean. But why is Donnie Darko a movie you need to watch before you die?
Well, aside from all of the theory behind time travel and science and all that, I think that like at the core of it, you can definitely latch onto what the film tries to say about emotion. I mean, like the scene about the fear and love lifeline, that's definitely a one-off scene, but the whole film itself goes very deeply into the emotions of love and wants, needs, fears, humor, excitement, a bunch of different ones that I'm just blanking on right now. But it definitely goes into, like, even one of the most eloquent things, I think, is when Donnie and Gretchen are walking through the woods and they have the conversation about the first kiss
Mm-hmm.
that Gretchen wants, and she wants it to be when she feels that everything is right in the world and not when a fat man in a red jumpsuit is watching us. And then when they do have that first kiss, it's after she's just been bullied and brought up the trauma of her childhood
Mm-hmm.
and all of that, and it's in the gesture that Donnie cares about her and is worried about what the guys just did to her. That's when she feels like the world is most perfect and genuine. And
Right.
I think the whole film at many points dissects emotions and wants and perceptions of things more than just surface level. And I think that itself is a good enough reason to watch it at least once.
Yeah, definitely. And I think there's lots of people who hate the film, and that's fine. But you can't watch this film and argue it didn't change the way you think or change the way you feel,
Right.
or ultimately have an impact on your life. Because love it or hate it, it's a thinker. It's a head scratcher, and it causes you to really take a good hard look at the way you live your life and the decisions you're making as a person and the implications they have,
Mm-hmm.
the sort of greater meaning behind them. And films that do that are incredibly important for viewing. Not even just films, but life experiences that do that are incredibly important for having.
Yeah.
And it's very seldom that you get that experience from a film. So when that comes along, you need to take full advantage of it, I think.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why for a couple of years I made it a goal of mine to make sure I watch this at least once a year to remind myself of that.
Yeah. I try to watch it every Halloween when the world will end.
One of these days, one of these years.
I think there's something in Donnie Darko that anybody can latch onto, whether you really start to think about it, you just watch it for the emotional implications and theory, or whether you just watch it and laugh.
Yeah.
I think everybody's going to find something enjoyable about it.
I completely agree. So if you've made it this far on the podcast and you haven't watched it yet,
Sorry we ruined a lot.
Sorry we ruined it. Well, I mean, in all reality, we didn't ruin that much. You can still watch it and probably be clueless and still have your own opinion and disagree with everything we said, which I guess is cool. But maybe you shouldn't have listened to the whole podcast. Oh, well. Whatever. We'll just call that a wrap on this episode then, I think, before my brain melts.
Yeah.
We've talked about so much. So that's all we have on this episode of Movies to Watch Before You Die. Thank you, Alden, for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
Glad to have you. Just dissecting one of our favorite films. And I feel like we got nowhere, but that's okay.
Yeah.
It's like the point, you know?
Yeah. There is no definitive place to get to with this film.
Right. And it's accepting that and being okay with it. And I'm working towards that every day.
But until then, it'll keep you up at night.
Right. So, as always, links to Rent or Buy the Film are on the show notes at markyazica.com. I think it's always great to watch Donnie Darko every year or two to sort of challenge yourself and watch an intellectual film that deals with so many crazy topics. And stay tuned for episode 10 of the podcast next Thursday, where we'll break down the 2010 film Inception and discuss a ton of cool themes, from the nature of reality to the necessity of dreams to the power of faith. Make sure you give it a watch before next week. Links for the film are also in the show notes. And if you'd like to support Movies to Watch Before You Die, might I recommend signing up for a free trial of Amazon Prime via the affiliate link in the show notes. Amazon Prime membership gets you unlimited free 2-day shipping, access to Kindle ebooks, and the ability to instantly watch thousands of movies and TV shows from Amazon's virtual library. You can get all those awesome things free for 30 days, and for every new sign-up, Amazon tosses some money our way. It's really great for all parties involved, so look for the link in the show notes and get started today. And finally, let us know what you're thinking and feeling after watching this week's film and listening to this week's episode. You can find us on social media via the show note links at markyazica.com, and while you're there, be sure to join our mailing list to stay up to date on all things related to movies to watch before you die. All right, everyone. Thanks for tuning in. We'll see you next time.